Chapter 1. The Day the Monsters Came. "David, what's wrong with you?" David put down his beer. "Thanks, man," he said. John rolled his eyes. "Be serious. You know what I mean. You just quit another job. How long were you working there? 6 months? Less?" 4 months, David thought but didn't say. It didn't work out. He'd known an office job wouldn't be his thing. He could run numbers through a computer as well as anyone else, but it wasn't how he wanted to spend the rest of his life. He was meant for more than that. "It never works out," John said. He turned to David, his expression solemn. David continued staring down at his beer, studying the label as if it held all the secrets of the universe. "You say it isn't for you. Well, what is?" "I don't know," David mumbled, the same response he always had. John stayed silent for a moment. Then, in a softer tone, he said, "It's not the job I worry about. You don't know what to do with yourself. You keep changing your mind about what you're supposed to do with your life. You go through girlfriends even faster than you go through jobs. I've got a good life. I have money, I have my gym pass, and I can even afford my own apartment." He hadn't always been able to. He'd lived with John and his family for almost 4 years after his parents' deaths. He was sure John's parents had been thrilled when he finally moved out of their basement. "Is that all you need? Exercise and a place to sleep?" John asked. He always worried too much. David shrugged. "You don't care about anything. Nothing makes you happy. Not anymore." David was silent, turning towards the television above the bar, pretending to watch the game. He didn't really see it. John didn't understand. He had a clear passion in life, and things came easily for him. He'd always wanted to be an engineer. He'd studied hard, gotten a degree, and found a job right out of college. He was happy with his work, earning good money, and he'd just proposed to his long-term girlfriend. David wasn't like John. He'd been passionate once, too, when he was still a kid. He'd barely graduated high school, finding mind-numbing, low-paying jobs ever since. "I know it hasn't been easy," John said, even though David was still staring at the television. "And we're still young. You have time. But you can't wander around expecting something fantastic to just appear one day. You have to go looking for it. So stop being an angst muffet and move." He finished his beer in one long swallow and stood up from the bar, dropping some bills next to his drink. "Thanks," he said. "I'll think about what you said." Then he turned, ignoring John's hurt look, and walked out of the bar. The cool autumn air hit him outside, and he pulled his jacket tighter around him. He walked quickly down the street, heading for the nearest subway station. As he walked, he tried not to resent John. John only ever had David's best interest at heart. It wasn't his fault David was a failure. Across the street spread a park. As David walked past, a leaf lifted off from the ground and floated away, although there was no breeze. He followed its path with a frown, and that was when he saw the bright light through the trees. David stopped and stared, squinting through pine trees that lined the park. It couldn't be a street light. It was too bright, and he'd never seen a street light that glowed blue. The light glowed steadily for maybe a minute before disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. David almost turned to continue his walk when he heard a loud screech. He jumped at the sound and looked around. He couldn't see anyone else. The screech came again. It almost sounded like a bird, but no birds were that loud. Not in Boston. He hesitated a moment longer, then crossed the street. He wouldn't get too close, just peer through the trees. It was probably just a bunch of kids causing trouble. Just in case, he pulled his cell phone out of his pocket. He slowed down as he reached the edge of the park, keeping close to the trees. The weird blue light had vanished, but there were a few streetlights inside the park, and it was just bright enough for him to see something that made his jaw drop. Off the path that ran through the park, not 10 feet from where David crouched, stood a group of hulking creatures arranged in a loose circle. David trembled as he stared at them. They looked a bit like lions. They were the same size and basic shape, he thought, staring in horror at their claws. They had bird heads, complete with enormous beaks, and out of their backs spread huge, leathery wings. Some distant part of David's brain labeled them as griffins. The one to the far right raised its head and let out another high-pitched screech that rattled David's bones. Then David noticed a woman standing in the center of the circle of monsters. He couldn't make out much detail since the monsters blocked his view, but she was holding a gun in her hand. He frowned, squinting at it. He couldn't see much detail from here, but it didn't look like any gun he'd ever seen before. A cold disc hung from her belt. David reached up and pinched his cheek, convinced he was either going mad or had drunk far more than he'd realized. He raised his cell phone and started dialing, sure the police wouldn't get here before the woman was killed. Also, how the fuck did a person make a 911 call for an attack by mythical creatures? The woman coolly cocked her gun at the nearest monster. No bang sounded, merely a faint humming noise. A red line appeared from the muzzle of the gun, striking the monster right between its eyes. With an abbreviated shriek, the monster collapsed in a heap. David stared, his fingers still poised above the last digit on his cell phone. Another screech of pain rang out. While he'd been staring, the woman had shot another monster with her laser beam gun, the second griffin also falling to the ground with a thud. Numbly, David put his cell phone back in his pocket. The woman didn't seem like she needed any help. She turned and shot again, twice in rapid succession, killing 2 more monsters. She moved swiftly and gracefully, hitting the monsters in the center of their foreheads with expert precision, and David wished he could see her more clearly. She turned as she killed another monster. Then one of the monsters lunged toward her back, claws extended, beak snapping. "Duck!" David yelled, jumping to his feet. The woman stumbled and fell to her knees. David didn't have time to see if she was okay because the remaining monsters turned, spotting him through the trees. He froze, his mouth going suddenly dry, realizing again that he was only 10 feet away. As one, the remaining monsters charged him. A female voice shouted something he didn't understand. He jumped at the woman's voice, turned, and ran as fast as he could. The pine trees that edged the park stood close enough together that the monsters couldn't easily maneuver amongst them, so David kept to the trees, frantically dodging branches and roots. He could barely see a foot in front of him, and he forced himself to keep his eyes on the ground. He tried not to listen to the sounds of the monsters pursuing him. From behind came another screech of pain, followed by a loud thump. He hoped the woman was still fighting the monsters. Soon, too soon, he reached the end of the park. He turned, following the line of trees around the corner. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw 2 monsters were almost on top of him. He turned back and ran faster, panting desperately. His foot caught a root, and he tumbled to the ground, his heart beat deafening. A snarl sounded from behind him as he struggled back to his feet, but it was cut off by a shriek. A strong hand grabbed him by the upper arm and dragged him to his feet. David barely had time to see that the woman had caught up to him before they were running through the pine trees again. The woman made to continue running through the trees, but David pulled her out and back into the park. The woman said something else. He didn't recognize the language. "Trust me," David said between breaths. He'd walked through this park many times. There was a pavilion in the center where people had picnics in the summer. More importantly, just beside the picnic stood a brick bathroom that he was fairly sure remained unlocked year-round. If they could get there, they might be safe. He could see the bathroom even now. He ran faster, trying to ignore the tightness in his chest, panting loudly for breath. The woman ran beside him, too busy to attack the monsters again. And then they reached the bathroom. The women's side was closer. David pushed the door open. The woman dashed inside, not slowing down. He lunged through after her, slamming the door closed behind him. The woman put her back to the door beside him. A moment later, the door shuddered as one of the monsters ran into it. But the door held firm. "Oh, God," David said, still panting. He'd just survived being attacked by make-believe monsters. Oh my fucking God. His legs shook, but he didn't move from the door. Weakly, he patted at the wall beside the door until he found the light switch. The sudden brightness made his eyes water. The woman moved away from beside him, grabbed a chair that stood near the baby-changing table, and wedged it against the door. David finally stumbled away from the door, trying to ignore the thumps as the monsters tried to get past. "You saved my life," he said to the woman. He finally had a chance to study her. She was older than he thought, from the hints of gray in her hair and the faint wrinkles at the corners of her eyes. At least 40, he judged. She wore a sleeveless red shirt, and he could clearly see the muscles in her arms. She was still attractive, with short, straight, dark hair and sharp eyes. Her cool laser beam gun was now holstered at her hip, and blood coated her left shoulder. And that gold disc still hung from her belt, unused. He stared at it, fascinated. The discus was maybe a foot across, with a large hole in the center. The edges looked very sharp. It reminded him of the weapon Xena used. The woman pulled something out of her pocket and pressed it against his temple. A small circle, maybe an inch across, that felt cool against his skin. Worried, he poked at it and touched metal. "Can you understand me now?" the woman asked. Her mouth moved, but the words that came out weren't synced up, like she was being badly dubbed. She brushed hair back from her temple, showing a piece of metal attached there. "Yes, what is—" "You saved my life too," the woman said, smiling at him. Her hand briefly touched her stomach. "I knew you would, David." He blinked. "How do you know my name?" Her smile turned soft. "I know everything about you, David Kemp. How could I not?" Then she shook her head. "We don't have much time to talk. I am Kethan Jing, and I am here to help you. We have to get back to where I was when you first called out to me." "Are you fucking insane? There are monsters out there." David waved at the door. As if on cue, it groaned under another assault. The entire door curved inward from the force of the blow. It held for now, but it wouldn't for much longer. He pulled his cell phone out of his pocket, relieved he hadn't dropped it, and started dialing. "No," Kethan said, putting her hand over his. "The authorities of this world cannot find out about this." David ignored her nonsense statement. "What else can we do? You can't kill all of those things." "We can get out that way," Kethan pointed. David followed her finger to see a small window above the toilet in the handicap stall. She walked over, stood on the rim of the toilet, and worked the latch on the window. "Won't the monsters see us?" David asked. He thought the window was big enough for him to fit through. "We're on the opposite side," Kethan said. She got the window open and stuck her head out to check. "They'll find us soon enough, but we only need a little time. The gateway will open again in a few minutes." She clambered through the window. After perching for a moment on the sill, she dropped down to the other side. David glanced back towards the door again and saw it had begun to splinter. He swallowed hard and hurried over to the window, finally stuffing his cell phone back in his pocket. Standing on the toilet, he was barely able to get his leg up to the window. He had to hunch down to fit his body through. Halfway, he pushed off the wall and tumbled down to the ground. There were bushes beneath the window that cushioned his fall, but he still scraped himself up pretty badly. He pulled himself out of the bushes, wincing and rubbing his arm. There were no monsters in sight, but for how long? David led Kethan further behind the bathroom until they were once again amongst the pine trees, hopefully hidden from sight. They tried to move as silently as they could. The row of trees curved, and David could faintly see the monsters. Only 4 griffins remained. David couldn't remember how many of them had been there to begin with. Even as he watched, the bathroom door splintered and fell. The lead monster pounced inside and roared when it found it empty. "Start running," Kethan whispered grimly and followed her own advice. David pulled his gaze away from the monsters and ran beside Kethan, still trying to keep quiet. In the distance, David could see the clearing where Kethan had first fought the monsters. Dead griffins littered the clearing, and a terrible stench filled the air. "How much longer?" he asked. "Too long," Kethan said grimly. She pulled the disc from where it hung on her belt and shoved it at David. He fumbled, barely catching it. "Ramira belongs to you. Take it." "What?" David glanced down and gaped. The disc had begun to glow golden as soon as he took hold of it. He was so surprised he nearly dropped it. "Throw it at the griffins when they get close." Kethan pulled out her futuristic gun from the holster at her side. An avian shriek sounded somewhere behind them. Kethan veered away from the relative safety of the pine trees and back out into the open. David bit his lip but followed her. If the monsters went after him, he wouldn't stand a chance. He had to stick close to Kethan. They reached the clearing, David being careful to keep clear of the corpses. Another squawk sounded, closer this time. The monsters were coming for them. He clutched the weapon tightly as he dared. I have no idea how to use this, you know. Kethon laughed. You burn like 1,000 suns. Brimira will respond to your every whim. And then there was no time for anything else, because the last 4 griffins appeared, loping rapidly towards them, their beady eyes gleaming under the streetlights. Kethon raised her gun and aimed, her arms steady. With a faint hum, a beam of reddish light shot out from the gun, striking one of the monsters in the forehead. The griffin fell over. The remaining 3 didn't slow down. David swallowed and grasped the disc in front of him, holding it as if it were a frisbee. Maybe it was just his imagination, but it seemed to be glowing brighter than it had before. He took aim at the monster on the left and threw it as hard as he could. To his eternal shock, he hit the monster in its thick neck. The disc, Brimira, tore right through it as if the griffin were no more substantial than paper. David stared. The neck was full of muscle and bone. Brimira, though sharp, had seemed quite flimsy. There was no way it should have been able to cut through the monster like that. But the monster tumbled to the ground in a spray of blood, its head flopping half off, clearly dead. I did it! David threw his hands into the air and turned to Kethon. Kethon shot again, killing another griffin. She glanced towards David, and her eyes widened. No! She grabbed David, pulling him down to the ground. David blinked stupidly, not understanding. He continued to stare as Kethon screamed in pain, and blood spurted down at David. They hit the ground, Kethon on top of David. Then he could see the last monster right above them. It raised a massive paw, gleaming red drops falling from its claws. David let out a wordless scream. There was a flash of gold, and suddenly Brimira appeared from behind the monster, boomeranging back towards David. The monster raised its head just in time for Brimira to cut through its neck. David yanked Kethon out of the way before its body crushed them. Brimira fell to the ground to his left, but he didn't pay it any attention. Kethon lay on the ground, bleeding heavily, breath harsh. Her eyes were closed against the pain. She'd saved his life again. Kethon? His voice shook. Somehow, she smiled. Don't feel guilty. I came here tonight knowing I would die. She had to stop while coughing up blood. She winced and continued, Whatever you do not fall in love. You have to. She cut off in another cough. Suddenly, the clearing was enveloped in a soft blue light. David stared, jaw hanging open. Just before him stood a large doorway, wreathed in blue light. On the other side stood a group of people, each holding different weapons and wearing heavy brown jackets. Beyond the people, he could see impossibly tall towers and a clear blue sky. Go, said the man in front, gesturing towards David. The people with him ran through the glowing doorway. David watched as they grabbed the bodies of the monsters and dragged them back with them through the doorway. One man grabbed David's arm and pulled him across the door. There was a faint tingle as they crossed it. What? David finally managed when they reached the other side. It was the middle of the day here and too warm for nightfall. The man ignored him, dragging him further from the door. David turned to see 2 men gently carrying Kethon across. She wasn't moving. She was dead, he realized, a lump forming in his throat. Less than a minute passed, and all the monsters had been pulled through the doorway. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the doorway vanished. David jumped, realizing that, wherever he was, he'd just been stranded here. He saw the first man holding Brimira, staring at it closely. The weapon no longer glowed. That's mine, he said without thinking. The black man looked up, frowning. He continued to carefully finger Brimira. What happened to Cardinal Jing? He asked. David blinked and trembled. The man who dragged him here finally let go of his arm, and David sank to the ground. What happened? He asked weakly. Where is this? Who are you? The first man's expression softened. He stepped over and placed a hand on David's shoulder. His grip was strong but kind. I am Roland Durin, steward of the 6th Traditional Division. Welcome to Bantong, the center of the world, Aeons' world.